when we start discussing about the process of industrialization in India, we would be starting from 1947 onwards, because organized efforts towards industrialization was for the first time visible after independence. Now, as the Britishers left India after their 2.5 century old rule, India inherited an economy which was essentially agrarian in nature. Agriculture was the dominant form of economic activity, engaging well over 80% of the Indian population, and the major form of income, around 90% of India's GDP, came from agriculture. Even the major industries of that time, like tea, jute, cotton, they were also agro-based ones. Though industry in some form started developing in India from 1918 onwards, after the end of the First World War, but the development was not that much significant. This can be understood from the fact that in 1947, the contribution of industry was only 7% of India's GDP. And even at the beginning of 1950s, to be specific, in 1951, Indian industry, along with mining and allied sectors and the SSI, contributed something like 12 to 14% of India's GDP, employing a meager 2.3% of the workforce. Now, bestowed with such an economy, Indian planners, policymakers, and the political leadership realized that something very serious needed to be done for development of industries in India. Consequently, import substitution was chosen as the strategy for industrial development. Now, why import substitution? Now, import substitution rests on the fact that imports need to be restricted and domestic production capabilities need to be built up, producing all those goods and services which were earlier imported. But there is one critical precondition for the success of import substitution strategy. That is, the capital goods sector needs to be developed first. Now, without the development of the capital goods sector, a country will not be possessing the means of production, say steel, cement, power, heavy machineries, which can be used in the secondary sector or in the consumer goods industry. But herein arose a problem for Indian industrialization. The Indian private sector at the time of independence and immediately thereafter was not in a position to contribute effectively towards the development of the capital goods sector. This was because capital goods industries required huge investments, advanced sophisticated technology, and it had a long gestation lag. So, the government was left with no other option but to come forward and build up industries on its own. And thereby, the public sector came into being, companies owned by the government. Now, the public sector industries developed, and along with the development of the public sector industries emerged a very stringent, or what we should say, a strong regulatory framework in India. The regulatory framework actually consisted of a host of laws and legislations. Some of the very prominent ones among them are the Industrial Licensing Policy, the MRTP Act of 1961, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act of 1974, and the very high tariff and quota restrictions which were imposed on imported items. Now, what was the objective of creating such a strong regulatory structure? It was done with some very specific objectives. Number one, it was to save the nascent Indian industry from foreign competition, in line with the infant industry argument as propounded by Friedrich List in 1884 in Germany. And the second objective was to prevent the growth of monopolistic tendencies in Indian industry. And the third very important reason was preventing foreign domination in Indian industry. Now, dominated by the public sector enterprises and backed up by this strong regulatory framework, Indian industry moved on. And it cannot be denied that it achieved a strong industrial base which gave it the capability to have across-the-board production facilities, producing most of the items which were earlier imported. So it can be said that the Indian public sector was realizing the dreams of their political leadership and the policymakers and planners of reaching the commanding heights of the economy. In India, public sector was not viewed as a business or a commercial entity. Rather, public sector was expected to deliver economic welfare to the Indian masses. And accordingly, it was thought that public sector could be used as a means of employment generation. And it is mainly at the insistence of the political leadership of that time, people were being employed in the public sector. But in doing so, there was no assessments made as to whether or how much workforce were required for the public sectors. And thereby, over time, most of the Indian public sectors were having a huge unproductive surplus labor force. That was only adding up to their costs. Along with these two policy-related issues, another factor considerably affected the functioning of Indian public sector during the period starting from late 1960s to early 1980s. During this period, the Indian consumer goods sector was not having the desirable growth, and the capital goods items normally have a derived demand. That is, their demand depends on the growth and expansion of the consumer goods sector. So as the consumer goods sector was not growing, the demand for capital goods item was constrained, and this was resulting in a stagnation of the sales and revenues of the capital goods producing PSUs. So on one hand, there was the rising unproductive expenditure on account of maintenance of a huge surplus labor force. Then there was this administered price mechanism which was not resulting in generation of surplus for the public sector enterprises. And combined with that was the stagnation in their sales and revenues. And all these three combined to create a situation in which many of the Indian PSUs were unable to meet their operational expenses and were running into perpetual deficits. Thus, the government, being owner of these public sector units, had to step in, and they had to dole out huge amount of money as subsidies to meet these rising deficits of the public sector units and keep them going on. This rising subsidy burden on the government was putting pressure on the exchequer. And what the government did, the government had no other alternative but to go in for huge amount of public borrowing. And as a result, a bulk of the public savings that was being generated, it was being channelized into government bonds and securities, leaving very little for the private sector to get. So there was a paucity of investable resources for the private sector, and even whatever was available, the cost of borrowing for the private sector was very high. And thus, these two combined to discourage private sector investments in Indian industry. So the scenario was a reflection of all around inefficiency in the Indian industry. Neither the public sector was running at the desirable level, nor there was growth and expansion of the private sector. Now, let us take a look at what the private sector enterprises which were there, they were doing. Even though Indian industry was dominated by public sector enterprises, private sector was there. They were represented by the handful of big business houses who, after amassing a huge fortune through trading activities in the colonial era, made their forays into industry. And these big business houses mostly participated in select few industries which catered to the consumers. Now, these private sector industries, they were also operating in a highly protected environment where competition was prevented from coming in. And almost they enjoyed monopoly position and utilized their near monopoly position to reap monopoly profits, and there was very little effort on their part to go in for productivity or qualitative improvements. How the industrial growth rate deteriorated over the 4 decades of regulated industrialization in India can be understood from the fact that during the first 15 years of India's industrialization process, that is from 1950 to 1965, Indian industry could achieve a growth rate of around 7.7%, that is near about 8% growth rate. But that plummeted to a very low level of 4% growth rate during the period beginning from late 1960s to early 1980s. In fact, this period has been termed as the darkest period in Indian history, a period characterized by very low quality, high cost industrial production. And this dismal performance of the Indian industry during the period from late 1960s to early 1980s more than offset the better performance of the beginning 15 years in such a way that if the entire 3-decade period from 1952 to 1982 is taken together, India is regarded as among the worst performer among the developing nations with regard to productivity and industrial growth rate. So as Indian industry reached the beginning of 1990s, it was very well realized by the Indian policymakers as also the political leadership of that time that something urgent must be done to arrest this deterioration of Indian industry. And it was realized that a policy overhaul was urgently needed. Consequently, the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1991 was enacted as the instrument of delivering reforms in Indian industry. The 1991 industrial reforms signaled a paradigm shift in the strategy of industrial development from import substitution to export promotion. Now, it was thought that by switching over to the export promotion strategy, Indian industry would be able to utilize its comparative advantage to gain competitive edge at the global level. Accordingly, the 1991 industrial policy reforms based on the three principles of liberalization, privatization, and globalization was formulated. The IPR 1991, which was the instrument for delivering the reform measures, carried out far-reaching changes which had far-reaching ramifications for the Indian industry. The changes which were carried out through the IPR 1991 were aimed at deregulating and debureaucratization of the Indian economy, where the businessmen and the investors would be able to take their business decisions based on their economic logic and on the market signals and not being dictated from the top. Besides, the IPR 1991 enacted measures which would allow a lot of space for the private sector to operate and which would enable the Indian private sector to take up a leading role in the industrialization process. Besides, special emphasis was put on enhancing the level of domestic and foreign competition in Indian industry, and in particular, channelizing increasing flow of foreign capital and foreign technology in Indian industry so that Indian industry can overcome the paucity of capital and the technology gap. Now, these very significant changes had its impact on the Indian industry. As the Indian industry has progressed for near about 3 decades in this changed policy regime, there have been some significant achievements. The Indian industry has really moved out from the very difficult situation which engulfed it during the early part of 1990s. There have been substantial increases in the level of domestic private and foreign investments. Particularly with regard to foreign investments, Indian industry has achieved a lot. According to the United Nations Center for Trade and Development, UNCTAD, in 2019, India is among the top 10 destinations for foreign investment. Based on these substantial increases in the level of domestic and foreign investment, Indian industry has made some rapid strides. It has achieved an industrial growth rate of 6.7%, which is near about 7%, over the 2 decades immediately after the initiation of reforms, that is during 1991-92 to 2011-12. Now, this 6.7% growth, which has been achieved by the Indian industry on an average during these 2 decades, is a commendable job if one considers the fact that this was achieved by overturning the very precarious situation in which Indian industry found itself in during early 1990s, when the industrial growth rate reached the lowest ever level of 0.6%. So, Indian industry has really made some definite strides, and the most significant stride has been in the export sector. The outward orientation of Indian industry has been indeed remarkably changed. India has been transformed from a low foreign exchange earning, primary product exporting country to a country which excels in the export of skill and knowledge-intensive value-added products. India's leading export earners today are IT and software products, gems and jewelry, ready-made garments, and leather products. Particularly, India is the global leader in the area of export of IT products and services and gems and jewelry. Not only this, the very face of Indian industry has undergone a change in the post-1991 era. Today, the flagship sectors of the Indian industry are the IT and the telecom sectors, which are regarded as the sunrise knowledge-based sectors. These sectors have achieved a phenomenal growth, and they are now contributing about 16% of India's GDP. So these are the progress which Indian industry has achieved after the initiation of reforms in 1991, and the reforms have indeed enabled Indian industry to make a mark in certain very key areas. But it is at the same time the Indian industry is confronted with multiple new challenges and issues which needs to be tackled very soon and very effectively. Otherwise, it may affect the prospects of Indian economy. Now, it is felt that in order to tackle these issues, there needs to be a second course correction in Indian industry. And this course correction must tackle some very key areas, key problem areas of the Indian industry. One such area which needs to be tackled is the existence of the structural imbalance in Indian industry. Now, the demand for service sector emerges from the industry and the manufacturing sector. So if the manufacturing industry doesn't grow enough, if it doesn't expand enough, the growth of the service sector cannot be sustained. So this is one key problem area with the Indian industry. The next area which needs to be attended to is the infrastructure sector. Indian infrastructure still lags behind the developed nations. Now, something must be done on an urgent basis so that the cost of production, distribution, and transportation for the Indian industries is reduced so that the demand for their products expands and leads to an increase in the industrial growth rate. Besides, one very specific area that needs to be attended to is increasing investments in the manufacturing industry. This is one area where India greatly lags behind than many other comparative economies. Now, in this connection, some of the policies which the government has adopted in recent times may be mentioned. One is the Make in India policy. As part of this policy, the government has identified 27 sectors where every effort is made to attract the global manufacturers to set up their manufacturing bases in India. And to aid in attraction of the global manufacturers in India, some specific areas have been identified by the government, like the infrastructure sector, where huge investments have been proposed in this year's budget so that the infrastructure sector gets improved and the global manufacturers are attracted by that. Besides, reforms in some key policy areas like the labor policy has also been proposed. Now, if all these work in complementarity with each other and are successful in attracting investments in the manufacturing sector in huge amount and transforming India into a global manufacturing hub, then Indian industry can only move to the next level in the league of industrialized nations.